I am so excited to be here with one of my favorite people. This is actually my son, John Linford, but I've not invited him just because he's my son. He actually is someone who understands one of our core concepts very well. And so I invited him to share some of his experiences and insights that he's gained about this principle of having touchstone or core media at the center. When we talk about digital centeredness, that's one of the places that we start. And here's the question that we pose to people in our first discussion called Start with Your Center. What are some touchstone or core media that have helped shaped me? This is the question we ask ourselves, that have shaped me and helped me feel and keep a sense of core purpose. So, John, first of all, if you could share some of your thoughts about and what you've learned both in your training and also in your experience, why does it matter to have touchstone or core media as a starting point as we are engaging in a complex and digitally driven world?
A great question. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. It is a pleasure personally to be here, of course, but this is one of my absolute favorite topics just because, and this is a theme that I'll draw on multiple times. This is a principle that I feel from start to finish is so present and so necessary. So as a little bit of background of my training, as you alluded to, I went to Carl's G. Mazur Preparatory Academy, a very long name for an awesome school. It's a public charter school in Utah. And it was based off a Socratic classical method of education. And so as part of that, we just read a lot of classics. And we, from a very young age, starting in 7th grade, we were exposed to a lot of different principles, a lot of different stories that had been around in human civilization for millennia in a lot of cases. And a couple ideas about touchstones immediately come to mind, just drawing from these classics and from the training that we received of thinking deeply and interacting through discussion. One of the first is the archetype of the hero's journey. It's something that's so classic that some people say, Homer kind of invented it, but in all reality, it's been around as long as humans have been around, right? That you have a hero that experiences trial or trauma, they overcome it to reach point B, whatever their destination ends up being. What is consistent across all those stories is there's always an opposition of some kind. And in response, there's some sort of inner strength or inner draw that is built upon to overcome it. So my favorite example is probably Odysseus. So in the Odyssey, he goes off to Troy, he fights this massive battle, he has to fight through a ton of stuff, all of his friends die, or most of his friends, and then he has to end up trying to make it back to Ithaca to see his wife. Now his wife's being awesome, she's holding down the fort back home, and she's being courted by all these guys who are eating all of her food and all this stuff. Crazy things are happening, and not only does he have to cross an entire ocean to get back home, but he has to run into monsters and witches and God-sent storms, all these different things. And his touchstone, using that word, what he continues to come back to is the integrity he has to his wife, the love that he has for his country, and the responsibility that he feels as the man of the house, as the provider, as the one who keeps everything together, as the rock of his household. His touchstone is something that, regardless of the external circumstances, is something that he's able to continue with. And again, we just see this repeated consistently and constantly. You go to Dante and you go to his experiences in the Inferno, right? He's literally being led through by Virgil, wrote the Aeneid. And what are some of his touchstones? Well, it's a lot of the Christian ideals. And of course, being in a Judeo-Christian society, these are things that we should pay attention to, if only because they've been iterative. They've been repeated across almost every civilization in some form, the thou shalt nots and thou shalts. And he finds that throughout all of it, he makes it all the way through the Inferno, makes it up into purgatory, and makes it on past that as well, by focusing on the good or the right. The Greeks talk about this a lot. These are all things that we talked about and learned about as part of our classical education. It became practical as in my junior and senior year, I actually helped create a class, you can do that in a public charter school, with a few of my friends, called Directed Readings, where we essentially read classical literature about education and had discussions and created essays and some sort of deliverable from that about how to create good education. And what we just kept coming back to is you have to have some sort of touchstone, some sort of thing that you can come back to. You can bring other ideals and ideas and compare them. And I think that bears fruit in a lot of different ways. In an education model specifically, especially as you're being raised in a place where, as you know, in your work, there's a lot of different voices, especially in a digital world. There's so many different things coming at you, so many different voices, especially at a young age. It's extremely overwhelming. And so to be able to give a child or a young student a litany of books, you say, hey, these are all really great books. They've withstood the test of time. That was one of the first things we discussed, is what makes a classic. And one of them is just longevity. The fact that the Aeneid and the Odyssey, actually I'll use Homer as an example because it's one of the best ones. Of the ancient texts, we essentially have one copy. You know, the Bible, just to juxtapose that, we have about 5,000 ancient copies of the Bible, but we have one of Homer. And yet it's been wildly successful and has continued through every age of time, which to me and to us in this class really speaks to, okay, there's something about this book that's pulling at something human within us that is constant across time. That's something that we can trust. As a touchstone, I think the first thing is consistency. That's a consistent message that you can constantly draw upon and apply in different situations. I think the next one, the second one, is that it clearly delineates good and evil. One of the things that we talked about frequently was how much evil to introduce into a book. The classic example was Brave New World. It's a dystopian novel which essentially creates a flipped moral society than the one that we currently experience. Well, maybe not anymore, but it's one that, you know, gratuitous sex, drug, alcohol use and a lifestyle is the normal. And the main character who objects to that, of maybe having one sexual partner, is looked down upon and actually chastened. What are you doing? This isn't our society. And the argument is, well, do we really want high schoolers reading this book because it exemplifies this sort of lifestyle? But throughout the book, it's very clear that he's fighting against something that's wrong. It's identified in the book, and as well with the right mentor. This is something we talked about as well. You have to have mentors with these touchstones. A lot of ideas. But you have to have both in order to know, once again, the opposition and the good, using the way the Greeks did, like good, this higher good, this eudaimonia, this good living, and together they can come together. Once you have a touchstone, once you have something that's consistent and can delineate at least some choices, it makes the other smaller choices a little bit easier. So for me personally, some of my core books are some of the ones that I've mentioned. So a lot of the classics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid are some of my favorites. I love the Inferno. I love Paradise Lost. These are books that have withstood the test of time. So that when, for instance, I come across Ender's Game, another one of my favorite books, or Speaker for the Dead, the second in that series, it's a little bit more nuanced, it's a little bit more complicated story, a lot of psychology, a lot of pretty difficult choices objectively that don't have super clear answers. And yeah, I'm able to go back to the basics, go back to my classics, go back to my touchstone and say, what resonates here? Ender's Game only came out, a decade ago, maybe a little bit over 15 years, perhaps. And yeah, I can match it up against classics and be able to derive those principles of continuity pretty well and find some sort of consistency, even if it hasn't lasted for very long. So kind of at a high level, it's a lot of thoughts, but a touchstone, I feel, is not only useful, but crucial. Because otherwise, if you don't have a touchstone, if you don't have something to return to, you're wishy-washy. Every new book and every new fad and every new political agenda just becomes the new thing, and it becomes just as good as the rest. So without some sort of more objective, I don't know if it's possibly completely, but more objective standard, you're able to sift and delineate between good, better, and best choices as you interact with a very complicated world.